The outlaw buried his gun beside the river, and the sheriff bowed his head in silence. The outlaw stumbled through the cottonwood shadows with a hand pressed to his ribs, feeling warm blood seep between his fingers as the silver-blue river came into view, wide and slow under the late evening sun, the only place he'd ever managed to think straight. He had outrun posses, bounty hunters, and every mistake he'd tried to bury inside himself. But he knew he wouldn't outrun the man following him now, not because the sheriff was faster, but because the sheriff knew him, knew the way he walked, the way he breathed, the way guilt could drag a man down heavier than any bullet. His boots slid in the mud as he reached the bank and fell to his knees, coughing hard enough to taste iron, and for a long moment he just knelt there, staring at the river that once meant freedom when he was a boy, swimming in it without a worry, long before he ever made a promise he couldn't keep, long before the town started whispering his name like a curse. The wind carried dust across the surface in thin ribbons, and he whispered, "It ends here. It's gotta end here," pushing himself upright with a groan as he unbuckled the holster that had hung at his hip for 15 years, the same holster that had taken him from a hungry ranch hand to a wanted man with posters nailed to every telegraph pole in 3 counties. His breath shook as he pulled the revolver free, but not to aim it, never again to aim it. And instead, he looked at it like a man looks at an old enemy who once pretended to be a friend, then walked to where the riverbank dipped and began digging with his bare hands, clawing through sand and wet earth until the hole was deep enough to swallow the steel that had ruined everything he'd ever cared about. He felt a strange calm settling in his bones, a kind of peace he hadn't known since he was 16 and standing beside the same river with a sheriff's badge in his hand, the one he was too afraid to accept. Now he shoved the gun into the earth and pushed the dirt back over it, packing it down tight as if burying it could somehow bury the part of himself that had hurt so many people. And as he sat back on his heels, chest heaving, he heard a distant crunch of gravel, the slow measured rhythm of a single horse approaching. No posse, no shouting, just one man who rode with the weight of every mile between them. He didn't turn around because he didn't need to. He knew that gait, that saddle creak, that quiet authority in every footstep. The sheriff had arrived, and the outlaw whispered to the river, "Let him come, I ain't running no more," before closing his eyes and waiting for the man who'd once been his closest friend to stand behind him at the water's edge. Sheriff Colton Hayes reined in his horse at the ridge, his breath catching when he saw the outlaw kneeling by the river with the mud-caked mound before him, a sight so quiet and strange it didn't match anything from the long, hard chase behind them. For a moment, he just sat in the saddle, staring down at the man he'd once called brother, remembering nights they'd ridden this same riverbank as boys, racing sticks in the current while swearing they'd grow up to protect the town together, not tear it apart. And it twisted something deep inside him to see how far those years had drifted apart like branches split by a storm. The sheriff nudged his horse forward and descended slowly, not raising his rifle, not shouting commands, just riding with the heavy certainty that this wasn't a cornered outlaw waiting to strike, but a man who had already made his choice long before Colton arrived. When he finally dismounted, boots sinking into the soft sand, he saw the outlaw's shoulders rise and fall with a tremor that wasn't fear, but exhaustion, like a man who had set down a burden heavier than any saddle could carry, and Colton approached with steps quiet enough to honor whatever moment he was interrupting. He stopped a few feet away, eyes on the freshly packed mound of earth, noticing the faint outline of a revolver's barrel still visible beneath the wet dirt. And something in him wavered, something old and bruised but still alive. The outlaw didn't turn, didn't speak, didn't defend himself. He just whispered, "I put it down, Colton. It's in the ground. I ain't touched it since Dry Butte." And the sheriff felt a sharp ache in his throat at the sound of his own name, spoken without bitterness for the first time in years. Wind pushed softly through the cottonwoods as Colton stepped closer, eyes scanning the outlaw's shaking hands, the blood soaking his shirt, the way he held himself like a man ready for judgment, but not for mercy. He swallowed hard and finally said, "You buried your gun." Not as a question, but as a truth he needed to speak aloud, and the outlaw nodded, still staring at the earth like he was afraid looking away would break whatever fragile peace he'd found. "I'm done fighting," he murmured, voice low and raw. "Done running, done hurting folks I never meant to hurt. It should have been me who paid long ago." And the sheriff felt those words hit him harder than any gunshot ever could. He knelt beside the mound, brushing a bit of dirt with his fingertips, understanding more in that moment than in all the miles he'd chased him, and whispered, "I chased you because I had to, not because I hated you," the confession slipping out like a truth he'd been holding on to for years. The outlaw bowed his head, jaw trembling as he said, "I know. That's why I stopped here. Figured if anyone should see this moment, it ought to be you." And Colton felt the river breeze cool the sweat at his temples as he realized the man before him wasn't the criminal he'd been hunting. He was the friend he'd lost, kneeling at the same river where everything between them had once begun. Colton didn't notice the blood at first. Not until the outlaw shifted his weight and the soaked fabric pulled across his ribs with a wet sound that made the sheriff's stomach knot. It wasn't the kind of wound a man walked away from easily, and certainly not the kind a man could outrun the law with, which meant only one thing. The outlaw hadn't been running at all. He'd been trying to make it here, to this river, to lay something to rest before the life leaked out of him entirely. "You're hurt," Colton said, though the words felt useless the moment they left his mouth, and the outlaw let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if it weren't cracked through with pain, murmuring, "Been hurt a long time, Colt. This one's just the first you can see." And the sheriff felt a sting behind his eyes because he knew exactly what kind of wound that meant. The kind a bullet caused and the kind a lifetime caused, and he wasn't sure which one was killing his old friend faster. Colton stepped closer, slow and careful, like approaching a wounded horse, and said, "Let me see it." But the outlaw shook his head, palm pressed weakly against his side as blood oozed through his fingers, whispering, "Ain't no use." And Colton felt heat rise behind his ribs, anger curling through him. Not at the outlaw, but at the stupid, stubborn man he'd always been. The one who thought he had to carry every burden alone, even the ones that broke him in half. "Who shot you?" the sheriff asked, voice low. But the outlaw only closed his eyes and said, "Does it matter? I'd done enough to deserve half the bullets in this territory." And Colton felt the words land heavy and sour because he knew some of that guilt was real, but not all of it, not by a long stretch, not enough to justify the way the man before him looked like he was already fading into the wind. A gust swept through the trees, sending leaves scattering, and for a moment the outlaw swayed like he might topple forward, so Colton reached out on instinct, gripping his arm to steady him, surprised by how cold his skin felt, how fast his pulse thudded beneath it. "Sit down," the sheriff said, guiding him toward a fallen log near the riverbank, and though the outlaw resisted at first, his knees buckled anyway, forcing him to take the seat. When he finally looked up at Colton, his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the wound, and everything to do with years running from decisions he couldn't outrun. "I didn't bury that gun because I was scared of you catching me," he said slowly, breath trembling. "I buried it because I didn't want to die with it in my hand." And Colton felt something tight coil in his chest, the kind of feeling that came from hearing the truth spoken without armor. The sheriff crouched beside him, one hand braced on the outlaw's shoulder, and whispered, "You're not dying today." But the outlaw only looked at him with a small, exhausted smile that said he wasn't so sure. And for the first time since chasing him across 5 counties, Colton Hayes realized he wasn't trying to arrest a criminal. He was trying to save the last piece of a friendship that had nearly bled out on the trail. Behind him, the wounded man watched in silence, shoulders heaving with slow, pained breaths, until he said in a voice that barely rose above the wind, "You don't gotta look. I know who they are." And Colton stood slowly, jaw hardening, because he'd already suspected the same thing. The Dalton brothers weren't the sort to leave a debt unpaid, and the outlaw had crossed them in a way men like that didn't forgive. "You should have told me," the sheriff muttered, scanning the tree line, every instinct sharpening like a blade. But the outlaw only huffed out a laugh, soaked in regret, saying, "Would you have listened? You always did think a badge was thicker than blood." And the old sting of that sentiment dug into Colton's ribs, because once, years ago, he might have believed the same thing. But right now he wasn't looking at a criminal or a fugitive. He was looking at the boy he'd grown up beside, the one who'd slept under his family's roof after storms and shared bread when winters got tight. The river murmured behind them, soft and steady, a cruel contrast to the tension swelling between the trees. And Colton knelt again, pressing firmer against the outlaw's wound to slow the bleeding, even though it made the man flinch. "They're not taking you," the sheriff said softly, a promise more than a declaration. But the outlaw shook his head, eyes dim with pain and something deeper, acceptance. "Colt, those men ain't coming to drag me back. They're coming to finish what they started," he whispered, and the sheriff's stomach dropped because he could see it now. The way the blood pattern on the trail shifted, the deliberate pace of the boot prints, the tightening gaps between each set. They weren't tracking an outlaw. They were hunting a dying man. "Why'd you bury the gun?" Colton asked, voice low, urgent, desperate to anchor him to something, anything. But the outlaw's gaze drifted toward the patch of dirt where he'd knelt moments earlier, fingers trembling when he said, "'Cause I didn't want to die with hell in my hands. I wanted to die with at least one thing clean." And the sheriff felt something break inside him, something raw and wordless, because he knew that wasn't the voice of a criminal. It was the voice of a man who'd carried sin so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. The branches rustled then, faint but certain, and Colton rose slowly, thumb brushing the worn handle of his revolver, eyes locked on the tree line while he whispered to the outlaw, "You're not dying here, not alone, not hunted," even though the tremor in his hand returned, harder this time, because for the first time in years, Sheriff Colton Hayes wasn't sure he could keep every promise he made. Colton didn't even realize his hand was trembling until he reached for the outlaw's side again and saw the shake in his fingers, a tremor born not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that they weren't alone. It was the tracks that did it, the fresh depressions in the mud just beyond the riverbank, deep and wide, like they'd been made by men who didn't bother to hide where they were going. Men who walked with purpose and weight and the arrogance of someone who believed they already owned the land they stepped on. The sheriff's breath tightened in his chest as he crouched, eyes narrowing on the footprints leading straight toward the trees. 3 sets, maybe 4, heavy boots, not ranch hands, not travelers, no scattered pattern, no hesitation, just a direct line as if they'd been following the outlaw's staggering trail until the blood drops told them they were close. The sound came first, a soft crunch of leaves under boots, deliberate and unhurried. The kind of walk men used when they wanted their arrival to be heard, when fear itself was meant to step out ahead of them like a shadow. Colton pivoted slowly, keeping his body angled between the outlaw and the trees as 3 figures emerged from the dim green. Elias Dalton in front, tall and narrow-eyed with that same rattlesnake grin he'd worn since they were boys, and his brothers flanking him, guns loose in their hands as if they were just part of their arms. "Sheriff Hayes," Elias drawled, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Didn't expect you to be babysitting him," and he nodded toward the outlaw slumped against the log, blood pooling darker now in the dirt beneath him. Colton didn't move, didn't blink, just rested his hand on his holster and said, "Trail ends here, Dalton. Turn around." But Elias only laughed, a thin, cold sound that didn't reach his eyes, replying, "You know better than that. He stole something that wasn't his, and we came to collect." And the outlaw coughed a laugh of his own, weak but sharp, whispering, "Wasn't yours neither," which made one of the Dalton brothers tense like he might shoot right then and there. Colton stepped sideways just enough to block their angle, voice low but steady as he said, "He buried his gun. He's done running." But Elias shrugged, spitting into the dirt, answering, "A man can bury hell, but it still waits under the dirt." And something in Colton's gut tightened because he knew there'd be no talking them down, not today, not with blood already spilled and the outlaw barely holding on. "This your plan?" Colton asked quietly, eyes narrowing. 3 guns against 1 unarmed man and a wounded one? And Elias grinned wider, saying, "No, Colt, 3 guns against a badge that should have known better than to pick the wrong side." And those words hit harder than the wind, harder than the tension tightening around them, because they weren't meant to taunt. They were meant to divide, to reach for that old scar between Colton and the outlaw, a scar the Daltons had never stopped poking at. A long moment stretched between them, River whispering behind his boots, the outlaw's breath rasping like sandpaper, and the Daltons' boots shifting subtly apart, spacing for a fight. Colton's hand hovered near his gun, thumb brushing the worn edge of the grip he'd palmed 1,000 times. But this time it felt heavier, like the weight of a choice he'd never wanted to face. "You walk away," Colton said, voice calm but cold, "or I put you in the ground." And Elias's grin twitched for the first time, something meaner surfacing as he whispered, "You ain't fast enough to save him." And before Colton could respond, the outlaw spoke for the first time with strength, raw, pained, but clear. "He doesn't need to save me. He just needs to stop you." And that single sentence, weak yet steady, shifted something in the sheriff's chest, the way old truth sometimes did. Elias's expression hardened, and in the space of a heartbeat, his hand twitched toward steel, just a whisper of motion. But Colton saw it, because he'd spent half his childhood learning the Daltons' tells, and the other half wishing he could forget them. And the moment the sheriff's fingers sealed around the handle of his revolver, he knew the quiet riverbank had just become the kind of place men remembered for the rest of their lives, or didn't live long enough to remember at all. The first shot didn't come from Colton or Elias. It came from the youngest Dalton, Wes, whose impatience outran his sense. A flash of muzzle fire slicing the air as the bullet kicked dirt inches from Colton's boot. And in that instant, the river seemed to stop whispering. The wind froze mid-breath, and the sheriff's world narrowed to a single, brutal truth. If he didn't draw now, neither he nor the wounded outlaw would leave this clearing alive. Steel cleared leather in one clean motion, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, and his first shot cracked across the riverbank with the kind of accuracy that came from years of practice, striking Wes in the shoulder and spinning him backwards into the reeds with a scream that tore through the quiet. Elias reacted instantly, dropping behind a fallen tree, shouting curses as he fired toward Colton, splintering bark near the sheriff's head, while the third Dalton, Morgan, flanked wide, boots hammering the ground in a deadly arc meant to box the sheriff in. Colton pivoted, firing once, twice, forcing Morgan behind a cluster of boulders. But even as he moved with the precision of a man who'd spent half his life enforcing law in a land that barely recognized it, the sheriff wasn't thinking about winning the fight. He was thinking of the outlaw behind him, slumped against the log, bleeding out with every passing second. A bullet tore past his cheek, hot enough to burn, and Colton dropped low, rolling behind a cottonwood trunk, the rough bark scraping his shoulder as he reloaded with shaking fingers. Across the clearing, Morgan shouted, "We'll gut you both, Hayes!" And Colton felt something old and sharp twist in his chest. Not fear, not rage, but the cold clarity of a man who finally understood what this was. A reckoning years in the making. Elias fired again, bullets thudding into the dirt near the outlaw, and Colton's heart slammed against his ribs as he shouted, "Stay down!" even though he knew the man could barely move. Then, suddenly, impossibly, the outlaw's voice cut through the gunfire, ragged but fierce. "Colt, right side!" And the sheriff didn't hesitate, spinning just as Morgan broke cover, raising his gun, eyes locked not on Colton, but on the outlaw. Time stretched thin as paper, the world shrinking to the glint of Morgan's barrel rising, the outlaw's fading breath, and the sheriff's trigger tightening. One shot, then another, both slamming into Morgan, dropping him hard to the riverbank where he didn't rise again. "Two down!" Colton yelled, chest heaving. But the victory was hollow because Elias was still out there, face twisted with venom, firing wild in grief for his fallen brothers. Bullets chewed inches from Colton's thigh, and the sheriff returned fire, forcing Elias deeper into cover until a sudden silence fell. No shouting, no gunfire, nothing but the outlaw's labored breathing and the faint ripple of the river. Colton moved cautiously, boots sliding over blood-dark soil, when Elias's voice erupted from the shadows, raw and shaking. "You took everything from me!" And he launched himself from behind the tree, gun raised, eyes burning red with grief and madness. But he wasn't aiming at Colton. He was aiming at the outlaw. Without thinking, without breathing, the sheriff threw himself between them, firing mid-step, and Elias staggered back, dropping his gun as he fell hard onto the dirt, staring up at the sky like he couldn't believe the world had outlived him. When the last echo faded, the sheriff turned, lungs burning, eyes frantic, and dropped to his knees beside the outlaw, whose breath now fluttered like a candle caught in wind, the gunfight over, the danger gone. But the real fight, the one to keep him alive, had only just begun. Colton barely felt the sting of the bullet graze on his own arm, or the burning in his lungs as he knelt beside the outlaw, because the only thing he could see was the way the man's skin had turned a washed-out gray. the way his breaths came shallow and irregular, like each one was a question he wasn't sure he had the strength to answer. The sheriff slid an arm behind him, lifting him gently, and the outlaw's head lolled forward onto Colton's shoulder, warm blood soaking through the sheriff's shirt in a spreading stain that made panic curl through his chest. "Stay with me," Colton whispered, voice cracking with a fear he hadn't let himself feel in years. "You hear me? Stay with me." But the outlaw's eyes fluttered, unfocused, like he was looking at something far away. Maybe the river, maybe memory, maybe the edge of whatever waited beyond the next breath. "You always were too loud," the outlaw murmured, breath thin, trying to smile, but failing as pain tightened across his face. Colton felt something in him crumble because despite everything, the years of silence, the accusations, the law between them, this was still the boy he'd grown up with. The one who'd thrown rocks at rattlesnakes with him and stolen pies from Miss Abernathy's windowsill. The one he'd once promised he'd never abandon. "Don't talk," Colton said, gripping his hand tight, as if he could anchor him to the world by sheer will. But the outlaw coughed, blood flecking his lips, and whispered, "Ain't much time left. Gotta say it now." And the sheriff shook his head hard, refusing to accept the finality in that tone. "You're not dying here," he said fiercely, though the tremble in his voice betrayed him. "Doc Carter's a mile out, just a mile. We can make it." But the outlaw's hand weakly squeezed his in a way that said he knew better. "Colt," he whispered, and the sheriff froze because he hadn't called him that in nearly 10 years, not since the night everything split between them. "I didn't run 'cause of the law," the outlaw continued, each word a struggle, eyelids dipping like they weighed 100 pounds. "I ran 'cause I couldn't bear you looking at me like you didn't know who I'd become." And Colton felt his throat tighten, memory slamming into him. The arguments, the arrests, the disappointment. But under all of it, the truth he'd refused to speak. He'd missed him, mourned him, loved him like a brother even after the world called him an enemy. "Look at me," Colton whispered, voice raw as he steadied the outlaw's face. "I've known who you were every day since. You made mistakes, but you never stopped being worth saving." And something like relief flickered in the outlaw's fading gaze. "Then hear me. One last thing," he choked, breath hitching. "Don't let them put me in some prison grave. Bury me beside the river, right where I buried that gun. I want the last thing I see to be something clean." And Colton's vision blurred as grief punched through him, sharp and merciless. "You'll see it," he whispered fiercely. "I swear it to you." And the outlaw nodded faintly, chest rising once more, then again slower, like the space between breaths was growing too wide for the world to cross. "Colt," he whispered one last time, voice barely a thread, "don't leave me." And Colton's voice broke completely as he answered, "I'm right here," holding him tighter as the outlaw sagged into him. Breaths growing so quiet, the river itself seemed to hush to hear whether another would come. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Colton stepped out of the cottonwood trees with Eli's body in his arms, and the whole world seemed to fall into a hush so complete it felt like even the wind knew better than to speak. His boots sank into the soft riverbank mud, his breath fogging faintly in the early chill, and every movement felt slower than it should have been, as if grief itself had settled on his shoulders along with the weight of the man he carried. Eli looked smaller in death, the tension gone from his jaw, the stubborn fire extinguished from his features, and Colton couldn't stop staring at the faint, dried blood at the corner of his mouth. remembering how the outlaw had tried to joke through the pain even as life drained out of him. The sheriff tightened his hold, unwilling to let the body shift even an inch, and began the long walk toward Hollow Creek. The path he'd ridden 1,000 times, yet today felt like stepping through a world made strange and unbearable. When he reached the first fence line at the edge of town, old Mrs. Harper was sweeping her porch, and her broom froze in midair as she saw him, her face collapsing into a soft, stunned sorrow. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, and Colton gave a numb nod, but didn't stop walking, boots crunching gravel as he moved down Main Street, where one by one doors opened, shutters lifted, and people stepped outside. Ranch hands with hats gripped in both hands, the blacksmith wiping soot from his brow, the preacher lowering his morning coffee, all of them falling silent as they saw their sheriff, usually iron-backed and unshakable, carrying the man he once swore he'd bring in dead or alive. The irony struck him like a knife. He had brought Eli in, but not at all the way he'd imagined. Whispers rippled through the watching crowd, but no one dared move closer. No one dared ask what happened, because the grief on Colton's face was something raw, something the town had never seen in him. Even children, usually darting through dust and morning light, froze at the sight, sensing something sacred in the moment. At the end of the street, Doc Carter stepped onto his porch, eyes going wide behind his spectacles as he took in the sheriff's slow approach. "Colton," the doctor murmured, voice lowering to a reverent hush. "Bring him inside." But the sheriff shook his head once, jaw clenched tight as he answered, "It's too late, Doc. He's gone." And the words scraped out of him like they were tearing pieces on their way out. For a long heartbeat, no one in town moved, and the silence grew so heavy it felt like the sky might crack under it. Until finally, the preacher stepped forward, removing his hat with a slow, solemn gesture, bowing his head in honor. One by one, every man, woman, and child followed suit, a ripple of quiet respect spreading up the street as Colton walked through them, the outlaw's body held in his arms like something not shameful, but precious. And as he passed, the sheriff's vision blurred. Not from tears this time, but from the weight of knowing that even after everything Eli had done, the town was offering him the dignity he'd never believed he deserved. Colton laid Eli's body on the table inside the small church, the same place where weddings were blessed, feuds were ended, and newborns were welcomed into the world. And for a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the outlaw's still face as shafts of morning light filtered through the dusty windows and painted gold across the wooden floorboards, turning the moment into something that felt too holy for the truth he was about to face. His hands trembled as he reached for the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as memories struck him with a force that made his breath hitch. Years of chasing Eli through canyons, across prairies, through rainstorms that swallowed trail dust and gun smoke alike. Years of thinking he knew exactly who the man was. A thief, a troublemaker, a restless soul bent on fighting the world. But last night, by the river, with death tightening around them like a closing fist, Eli had confessed something Colton had never been prepared to hear, something that cracked open an old wound the sheriff had spent half a lifetime hardening himself against. "I didn't shoot your father," Eli had whispered, voice ragged, breath shallow, mud streaked across his jaw as the river roared beside them. "I tried to stop them, Colton. I tried to warn him. I wasn't fast enough." And the sheriff had felt the words hit him like a bullet. Because for years he'd carried the certainty that Eli Rhodes was the man who'd robbed him of a father and a childhood and a sense of justice that didn't burn. For years he'd built himself into a lawman with iron rules and clear lines, because believing in Eli's guilt kept everything simple, kept grief from becoming something murkier, something like doubt. But now, staring at the outlaw's still hands, calloused and scarred from work far harder and more honest than Colton ever imagined, he felt the foundation of his life tilt beneath him. The truth settled in slowly, painfully. Eli had been running all these years not because he was guilty, but because he carried blame that wasn't his, and because he knew that Colton, so desperate to honor his father, would never have listened to the truth unless it was spoken in the very last breaths of a dying man. The sheriff bowed his head, one hand lifting to cover his face as a low, choked sound escaped him. Half grief, half apology, the kind of sound a man makes when the world he built in his heart finally collapses. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he whispered, voice shaking, though he already knew the answer. Because Eli had been afraid, because Colton had been too stubborn, because fate had twisted them into enemies when they might have been something closer to brothers. Footsteps echoed softly behind him, and the preacher stepped forward, resting a gentle hand on the sheriff's shoulder, murmuring, "Truth finds its way, son, sometimes too late, sometimes just in time." And Colton swallowed hard, eyes burning as he realized that Eli's death wasn't just an ending, it was a reckoning, one he could no longer turn away from. The sun was lowering behind the cottonwoods when the townsfolk gathered by the riverbank, the same stretch of water that had carried Eli through half his life and nearly taken the rest on the night he died. And Colton stood at the front of them all with his hat pressed to his chest, eyes fixed on the dirt at his boots because he didn't trust himself to look anywhere else. The preacher cleared his throat softly, his voice carrying low and steady across the hush of evening. But Colton barely heard the words. He only heard Eli's final confession replaying over and over, each syllable cutting deeper and forcing him to see the truth he'd refused to reckon with for years. When the prayer ended, the sheriff stepped forward, fingers trembling as he knelt by the small wooden marker they'd placed near the water's edge. Not a grave, for Eli wanted to be buried in the canyon where he was born, but a place the town could come to remember him, because no matter what he used to be, he had died with more honor than most men ever lived with. Colton bowed his head, breathing shakily, and the people behind him watched in silence as he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out the star he'd worn since the day he became law in this county, the one symbol he'd clung to for meaning, direction, righteousness. But now it felt heavy for a different reason, as if every judgment he'd ever made without knowing the whole truth was fused into its metal. He set it gently on the ground beside the marker, his voice raw when he finally spoke. "I spent half my life chasing a ghost of what I thought happened. But you were right there, living with the truth I didn't want to see," he whispered, his breath trembling as the river murmured behind him, its soft murmur sounding almost like an answer. A few townsfolk wiped their eyes, not because they mourned Eli as a beloved man. They had feared him, cursed him, whispered about him for years, but because seeing the sheriff crumble under the weight of regret made them realize that justice was never as simple as they wished it to be. Colton stayed there a long moment before rising slowly, lifting his gaze toward the dusky sky as though looking for something he'd lost. His father, his faith in the law, maybe even a part of himself. And when he finally turned to face the people who trusted him to protect the county, he spoke with a steadiness that didn't come from strength, but from surrender. "I was wrong about Eli Rhodes. Wrong in ways that cost too much, he said quietly. But I'll spend the rest of my days making sure this badge means truth, not just punishment. And the crowd shifted, a murmur of understanding sweeping through them. As the river glimmered gold with the last touch of daylight, Colton walked toward his horse with a slower, gentler stride than he'd ever taken, as if the land itself had softened under him. And before mounting, he looked back once more at the marker near the water. "Rest easy now," he murmured. "The river's got you, and I'll carry the rest." And with that, he rode into the deepening twilight, a man no longer defined by the outlaw he chased, but by the truth he finally chose to face.